Let's begin by reading once again from chapter 9, verses 1 through 10. Now, even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary. For a tent was prepared, the outer one, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of offering. It is called the Holy Place. Behind the second curtain stood a tent called the Holy of Holies, having the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered on all sides with gold, which contained a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. These preparations having thus been made, the priests go continually into the outer tent, performing their ritual duties. But into the second only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the errors of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the sanctuary is not yet opened, as long as the outer tent is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered which cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various baptisms, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation. So it said that we would start with by examining his errors in the arrangement of the outer and inner tabernacle. The first thing is that he appears to have two tents or two tabernacles instead of one. That's probably actually a misunderstanding. He refers to where a tent was prepared, he says the outer one, and then behind the second curtain stood a tent. But he is probably using tent or tabernacle here in the sense of compartments, and they're sequential. So there's an outer and there's an inner, but there's only one tent, or only one tabernacle. There's a whole discussion of the Greek and his use of it in the meaning and an examination of that suggests that that's what he means, and not that he's made a mistake. So a second one is that the altar of incense, he places it in the inner tabernacle, in the inner compartment, in the Holy of Holies. Mm-hmm. It's been argued that he did that because of the ambiguity of the of Exodus, and it's what it says about the placement of the altar of incense. But that probably isn't accurate, and also logically. So let's take a look at the altar of incense. It's in Exodus chapter 30, verses 1 through 10. You shall make an altar to burn incense upon. Of acacia wood shall you make it. A cubit shall be its length, and a cubit its breadth. It shall be square, and 2 cubits shall be its height. Its horns shall be of one piece with it. You shall overlay it with pure gold, its top and its sides round about, and its horns. And you shall make for it a molding of gold round about. And 2 golden rings shall you make for it. Under its molding on two opposite sides of it, you shall make them, and they shall be holders for poles with which to carry it. You shall make the poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. You shall put it before the veil that is by the ark of the covenant, before the mercy seat that is over the covenant, where I will meet with you. That's somewhat ambiguous, since it mentions before the veil that is by the ark of the covenant, before the mercy seat, etc., which could seem to mean that it's near the ark of the covenant on that side of the veil. It has the ark of the covenant. And Aaron shall burn fragrant incense on it. Every morning when he dresses the lamps, he shall burn it. And when Aaron sets up the lamps in the evening, he shall burn it, a perpetual incense before the Lord throughout your generations. You shall offer no unholy incense thereon, nor burnt offering, nor cereal offering, and you shall pour no libation thereon. Aaron shall make atonement upon its horns once a year. With the blood of the sin offering of atonement, he shall make atonement for it once in the year throughout your generations. It is most holy to the Lord. So the issue is that the lamps are the incense rather is to be kept lit forever. And so it has to be refreshed each morning and each evening. But if it's in the Holy of Holies, that can't happen. So it's so regardless of the ambiguity, it's clear that the altar of incense has to be outside of the Holy of Holies and in the holy place. So why has he made that mistake?
Well, in his, he says that the priests go continually into the outer tent to perform their ritual duties. I'm wondering if he's thinking the incense is in the outer tent then.
Well, he appears to be, he places the altar of incense in the Holy of Holies.
Behind the second curtain.
Behind the second curtain,
yeah.
Behind the second curtain stood a tent called the Holy of Holies, having the golden altar of incense, Ark of the Covenant covered, etc., and holding manna, Aaron's rod, tables of the covenant. What happens in the holy place besides the changing of the bread of the presence, beside the refreshing of the incense? What else happens in the holy place?
Sacrifices.
Sacrifices, right? What kind of sacrifices?
Well, it depends on the bull for the high priest.
That's in the Holy of Holies.
Oh, you're talking about the outer then?
Yeah.
Okay.
And what happens in the holy place?
Unblemished animals and birds.
But for what?
For the common people.
Well, yeah.
Sins of the common people.
For the most part, for individual sins.
Yeah.
And so, what is the author concerned about?
The author in Hebrews,
Mm-hmm.
His concern is that this is now going to be passé because we now have Jesus who made reparations for all the sins of everyone.
But even within the context of Old Testament worship, what is and it's true of New Testament worship as well. So it's important to keep that in mind. We discussed this in one class a number of classes ago. So remember, his focus is not on individual worship, not on individual sin, but rather on the people of God as a whole. So his focal point is the people of God, and he's not very interested in the individual worshiper. He's not very interested in the individual sin. He's viewing this very much within the perspective of the people of God and cultic worship.
Mhm.
And so he's moved, apparently, the altar of incense from the holy place to the Holy of Holies, I would suspect deliberately. So given that, why might he have done it deliberately? In all of these cases, I would argue that he's changed the detail, but he hasn't done it because he's mistaken about anything. I think in each case he's done it deliberately. I mean, the 2/10 is sort of a linguistic issue, so that doesn't really matter so much. But this does. This is a deliberate change. So why is that?
Maybe because it's for a greater sacrifice. It's not for individual sacrifices, but the people as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And greater things happen in the Holy of Holies.
Right. So he's moving our gaze in terms of looking at sacrifice from the holy place, which he's not terribly interested in as a place of sacrifice, to the Holy of Holies. And he's doing that because the golden altar of incense can also be seen as a censer. What actually happens is that the incense to burn in the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement is taken and put into a censer from the altar of incense, which is that censer is then taken into the Holy of Holies, and it provides the incense and the smoke that allows the priest to minister without directly seeing the face of God and dying. So, in some sense, from that incense from the altar, from the altar of incense, put in a censer, it enters the Holy of Holies, and so he's just sort of skipping over all of that detail and simply moving the altar of incense into the Holy of Holies, because the censer basically does the same thing. And so the reason he's doing that is because he's focusing on corporate sin. He's focusing on corporate sacrifice. And he wants to completely evade or avoid the issue of individual sin, because that doesn't really, because he's not concerned with it.
Are you saying corporate or corporal?
Corporate.
Okay.
And so his focus is on the people of God, and he's not focused on individuals. So that's a really refreshing kind of, we tend to focus often on ourselves, but the author isn't concerned about ourselves. He's not concerned about individuals. He's concerned about the status of the people of God and how can the people of God approach God. So in many ways, we see some return to that emphasis in Vatican II, where they write about, Vatican documents write about the church as a sacrament. The church itself is a sacrament because underneath the physical church is Christ, and each believer is a sacrament, hopefully, because beneath each believer hides Christ, or in each believer is hidden the image of Christ. So that's the second. A third that I said was minor, and I just realized isn't minor at all, is that he has the Aaron's rod that budded and the manna in the Ark of the Covenant and not outside it. And Exodus clearly indicates that they're outside it. Let's take a look at that. It's Exodus chapter 16, verses 33 and 34. Let's start at verse 31 of chapter 16. Now the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. And Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." And Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it and place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations." As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the covenant to be kept. And the sons of Israel ate the manna 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. So it's before the ark. And similarly, let's look at Aaron's rod that budded, which is in Numbers chapter 17. So there's contention here about how it is that Aaron gets to be the priest and nobody else. And so we see the resolution of the issue here. So Numbers 17, verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the sons of Israel and get from them rods, one for each father's house, from all their leaders according to their father's houses, 12 rods. Write each man's name upon his rod, and write Aaron's name upon the rod of Levi. For there shall be one rod for the head of each father's house. Then you shall deposit them in the tent of meeting before the covenant where I meet with you. And the rod of the man whom I choose shall sprout. Thus I will make to cease from me the murmurings of the sons of Israel, which they murmur against you." Moses spoke to the sons of Israel, and all their leaders gave them rods, one for each leader, according to their fathers' houses, 12 rods. And the rod of Aaron was among their rods. And Moses deposited the rods before the Lord in the tent of the covenant. And the next day Moses went into the tent of the covenant, and behold, the rod of Aaron for the house of Levi had sprouted and put forth buds and produced blossoms, and it bore ripe almonds. Then Moses brought out all the rods from before the Lord to all the sons of Israel, and they looked, and each man took his rod. And the Lord said to Moses, "Put back the rod of Aaron before the covenant, to be kept as a sign for the rebels, that you may make an end of their murmurings against me, lest they die. So put the rod of Aaron before the covenant. Thus did Moses as the Lord commanded him. So he did. So the tablets, with the Ten Commandments, which represent the covenant, the Aaron's rod that budded, and the manna. So of those, only the tablets are actually in the ark. So why does the author place the other two in the ark?
Why did he place what into the ark?
Why does he have them in the ark when they're not? Why has he said that they're in the ark of the covenant? He could be mistaken, but there might be another reason or
He was
other
waiting
reasons.
for one to sprout, right?
Well, it's already sprouted.
Oh, it's already sprouted. Well, that's why he took it back. The others took their rods, right?
No. Yeah,
That's in,
it's Aaron's rod that was
Right.
placed in the Holy of Holies before the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
But the issue is that the author of Hebrews has it inside the Ark of the Covenant when it's not.
Oh, I see.
So that's true of the manna, the jar of manna, and it's true of the Aaron's rod that budded. So why does he have those things in the Ark of the Covenant when they're not?
those are all from times of tribulation or trials, because the tribes were fighting over who should be leaders, who's the hot, the best. The manna was because they didn't have food when they were traveling in the desert. All these things are now not needed because now we have Christ.
Well, no, actually, they are needed. They because, well, think about it. If they're
Is Aaron's rod still needed to show who's the top person? I don't think so.
look at them as symbols.
Oh,
Look at it. So this really represents symbolism. So we have the tablets in the tabernacle in the Ark of the Covenant. We have the other stuff outside. So they're kind of disconnected.
Don't they
So,
eventually get in there?
well, they eventually get gone. They eventually get gone. In
Right.
Solomon's temple, there are only the tablets in the Ark of the Covenant, and no manna and no rod that budded. And then after the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, the Ark of the Covenant is also lost. So in the second temple, the Holy of Holies is basically empty. But
so the one thing that's in the ark then are the tablets, which the commandments are no longer written on tablets; they're written in our hearts. So we don't need to have those visible.
Right. But look at the Ark of the Covenant. Over it is the mercy seat, which is where God is. Right. So in some sense, the Ark, the mercy seat, can be seen as representing God. Okay, now if you put this stuff outside of it, it becomes separate in some way. They just become things. There's this rod that budded there. There's a jar of manna there. And then inside is the covenant. Now, you move the rod. What does the rod represent? Abstracting from a particular covenant.
Priest?
Priesthood. The rod represents priesthood. It represents Aaron's priesthood, but more generally, it represents priesthood. The tablet, the 10 Commandments are themselves symbolic of the Mosaic law. So they're a part of a much larger whole. And as symbolic of the Mosaic law, that means that the tablets are also symbolic of covenant in a more abstract sense. So we have priest, covenant, and remember, priesthood is tightly bound to covenant in the author's opinion, and then also, as we discussed last week, from the Mosaic law and its presentation in Exodus, they're very closely coupled. So we have priesthood and we have covenant, and then the manna,
replaced by the Eucharist.
the bread of life. And so those things are all symbolic, and they find their fulfillment in Christ. So by moving them, by changing the arrangement so that they're no longer these loose things outside, and placing them in the Ark of the Covenant, he makes it very clear that those things point forward to the priesthood of Christ, the new covenant introduced by Christ, and Christ as the bread of life, as the new manna, as the Eucharist. So here with this sort of minor readjustment, he's really making a major theological statement. He's linking together the covenants. He's showing that the old covenant points forward and finds its fulfillment in the new covenant. He's establishing both continuity and discontinuity, all by doing this, making this simple change. So I don't think it is accidental. I think he's doing it for precisely that reason. Does anyone remember what the fourth thing that he changed was?
High priest enters and leaves the Holy of Holies once a week.
Right.
I don't remember. I wrote it down.
Wasn't it once a year?
Yeah, it's once a year, but right. So the question is, he makes it appear that the high priest enters and leaves only once a year. And so for some, that's been a kind of article of or an item of critique. Whereas in fact, although the high priest only enters on one day a year, he enters multiple times.
Say that again.
Yeah.
High priest that enters one day a year, he enters multiple times.
Multiple times during that day.
Oh.
Good thing he had a rope around him.
Yeah. In Leviticus chapter 16, actually, let's read the section on the Day of Atonement. So I think that might be useful. Let's start at chapter 16, start at verse 2 and jump around a bit. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at all times into the holy place within the veil, before the mercy seat which is upon the ark, lest he die. For I will appear in the cloud upon the mercy seat. But thus shall Aaron come into the holy place with the young bull. This is the Holy of Holies. But actually, this is the holy place, and then he goes into the Holy of Holies. But thus shall Aaron come into the holy place, the young bull for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat, and shall have the linen breeches on his body, be girded with the linen sash, and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water and then put them on. And he shall take from the congregation of the sons of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering and 1 ram for a burnt offering. Let's jump to 11. And Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. And he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small, and he shall bring it within the veil, and put the incense on the fire before the Lord. So here is the taking of the censer and the incense from the altar of incense into the Holy of Holies. And put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat, which is upon the covenant, lest he die. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat. And before the mercy seat, he shall sprinkle the blood with his finger 7 times. Then he shall kill the goat of the sin offering, which is for the people, and bring its blood within the veil. So that's a trip out and a trip in the goat. And do with its blood as he did with the blood of the bull, sprinkling it upon the mercy seat and before the mercy seat. Thus he shall make atonement for the holy place because of its uncleanliness of the sons of Israel, and because of their transgressions, all their sins. So he shall do for the tent of meeting, which abides with them in their midst of their uncleanliness. We can stop there. So in Leviticus, the high priest enters twice, once to sprinkle the blood of the bull, and once to sprinkle the blood of the goat. In the rabbinic commentary from the Mishnah, the rabbis thought that there were 2 more entrances. The first entrance to place the fire pan and ladle, the incense, the censer, to create the smoke. And then the fourth, to retrieve the ladle and the fire pan left from offering incense. So certainly 3 trips and 4, but the author isn't concerned with the minutiae. He's concerned with the overall fact that on 1 day a year, the high priest enters the Holy of Holies. So that's not an inaccuracy. It's simply a higher level focus, not on the minutia of what goes on the Day of Atonement. Then there's also actually another one, which is that he says in the holy place, for a tent was prepared the outer one, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of offering. It is called the holy place. Given that he locates the rod and the manna in the Ark of the Covenant, it seems unusual that he doesn't mention that the bread of offering or the bread of the presence is on the table. He seems to treat it as if it's separate. So, sort of a separate item, it's separate from the table, which in fact was made to hold the bread of the presence and the wine. So why might he do that? But remember, what is the bread of the presence?
The Eucharist?
Um,
No.
yes, sort of. I mean, it's also called the bread of the face of God. And so here again, it points forward to Christ, who is the face of God. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Christ is. So it points forward to Christ, and it also, in some sense, remember that. So it's, I think, on the north side, and on the south side is the menorah. And so the purpose of the menorah is to illumine the bread, which is the bread of the face of God. There are 12 loaves representing each of the 12 tribes of Israel. So that the bread of the face of God has, in some sense, a dual symbolism. It's the face of God, and because it's the 12 tribes of Israel, it also represents the people of God. And so the menorah, in illuminating the bread of God, or the bread of the face of God, or the bread of the presence, illuminates the people of God, behind whom is God. Right? So it's basically the same thing as the church of the sacrament, that behind the people of God is God. The people of God are images of God, or are imitations of God, or in modern terminology, are imitations of Christ. So he's detaching it from the table, because the table isn't of any particular significance other than holding the bread, which he's not very interested in holding it. He's interested in that symbolism. So the bread of the face of God points forward to Christ and to those who imitate Christ. So he's not making any of this explicit, but I think he's expecting his readers to pick up on it. And the bread of the face, we've lost a sense of the bread of the presence, or the bread of the face of God. For a long time, it was misexpressed as showbread, which is a fairly meaningless term. But for early Christians, the relationship between Christ and the bread of the presence in the temple was a very, very, very clear and very transparent one. So that's an important symbol.
Just that this is a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
You mentioned the menorah,
Uh-huh.
and how's it referenced in the Bible? I never hear that word.
I don't think it's called menorah. It's called the lampstand.
Called what?
It's called the lampstand.
Oh, lampstand. Okay, but that's the menorah.
That's the menorah. We can take a look. It's Exodus chapter 25, verses 31 through 40.
The lampstand. Okay.
Yeah, the table for the bread of the presence is defined right before that in chapter 25, verses 23 through 30, and 31, the lampstand. You shall make a lampstand of pure gold. Base and the shaft of the lampstand shall be made of hammered work. Its cups, its capitals, and its flowers shall be of one piece with it. And there shall be 6 branches going out of its sides, 3 branches of the lampstands out of one side of it, and 3 branches of the lampstand out of the other side of it. So 7 altogether. 3 cups made like almonds, each with capital and flower on one branch, and 3 cups made like almonds, each with capital and flower on the other branch. So for the 6 branches going out of the lampstand. And on the lampstand itself, 4 cups made like almonds, with their capitals and flowers, and a capital of one piece with it under each pair of the 6 branches going out from the lampstand. And then it goes on. So it's referred to as a lampstand. So he argues that sacrifice under the old covenant can't perfect the conscience of the worshiper. Why is that? Well, first of all, what is sacrifice? I guess that's the critical question here. What do we mean by what is sacrifice? What do we mean by sacrifice?
Offering that's made to God. Usually in those times it was an animal that was slaughtered.
Mm-hmm.
And the blood symbolized people, right?
Mm-hmm. Symbolizes life.
And their sins.
Mm-hmm. So why were we sacrificing?
To please God.
Atonement for sins.
How does that change us? How can one be changed by sacrifice?
Oh, weren't they like burnt offerings?
Mm-hmm.
So it was something that they would normally have eaten, but because they had sinned, they were giving it up to God instead of enjoying it themselves.
And why are they doing that?
That was their penance. I don't know.
Good answer.
So when we think of sacrifice, we think of giving up something, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give up something begrudgingly.
Yeah, and they would love to have eaten the meat of these animals, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, and
And
often, and our own view of sacrifice is, giving up something that we really would rather not give up. So it's kind of grudging. So, the most common view is that you're sacrificing in order to get something from God.
well, and God asked Abraham for the life of his son, his firstborn son.
Mm-hmm.
And at the last minute, a ram was provided.
Mm-hmm.
And told him that he realized that he was willing to sacrifice his own son.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So he knew that he was serious.
Well,
Right.
God requested it.
Right, but I mean, he loved God so much that
Right.
he was willing to
He
do
was
it.
willing to, yeah. So the sacrifices are what God requested. It was part of the law of what was supposed to be given for what and when.
Well, so one of the points of the sacrifice of Abraham is that human sacrifice is not acceptable to God. And so surrounding people's particularly in times of hardship, did sacrifice their own children. So why would you, let's take that as an extreme case, why would you sacrifice your own children? What is the motivation to sacrifice?
I don't know.
Because I'm sure the people who sacrifice their own children do not do it joyously.
I'm sure.
That's not, you know, not a fun thing to do.
I guess if they didn't have any animals to sacrifice. Mm,
What is the well, possibly, but think about it in the context of us sacrificing begrudgingly. Why?
We are
We're
putting
giving back to
God's,
God,
What?
giving back to God
Giving back to God for what reason?
because of our sins as atonement. Because we've, as a people of God, we'd like to be in heaven.
You want your sins to be forgiven, and you want your relationship with God to be improved, usually because you want to extract God's favor and blessing, right? So the basis of sacrifice is typically, what do I need to do to appease God? What do I do, to make God happy so that, we can read the curses in Deuteronomy where, you get feasted on by birds and things. So what do I do so that that doesn't happen to me and I keep God happy, right? So the focus of sacrifice is the question of sacrifice is, what do we need to do to change God's attitude toward us? Right?
Mm.
What would the author call that? What is the author's view of what sacrifice should be and is under the new covenant? So then, under the old covenant, sacrifice is something you do to change God's attitude toward you.
And
What is sacrifice under the new covenant?
To give back to God what he gives us.
Yeah, but what happens in the process and what is the motivation?
to give glory to God
For what purpose?
because of all he has done for us.
To make him,
We're giving him back what he's already given us.
And what happens in the process?
we should be transformed.
You should be transformed. Right. So it's not, so the relationship is completely different. And that's what he means by perfecting the conscience of the worshiper.
Mm.
So you're giving stuff to God, sacrificing, so that you can receive God's blessing. And the focus becomes on, what am I getting? And is God going to be good to me? And that doesn't perfect the conscience of the worshiper. So you're through sacrifice, you're hoping that you affect God, which when you think about it is absurd. A sacrifice that affects the conscience of the worshiper means that sacrifice affects the one who is offering the sacrifice, us, not God to whom sacrifice is being offered. And so sacrifice should transform the one making the sacrifice. It's not going to transform God. And to think it is in the first place is absurd. So that's
So
so
by sacrificing our child, which is so important to us.
well that's the point. Why do you sacrifice your child, which is so important to us? You do it particularly in times of famine, in times of drought, in times of whatever, to please God so that he blesses you, brings rain, brings fertility, brings something so that you all don't die.
Oh, I don't know about that.
No, it's
I think if you want to well,
I mean that's the pagan religions, but it's important to understand the context that there was human sacrifice, that it wasn't done joy. I mean, so I'm using that kind of as an extreme case that is also representative of sacrifice under the old covenant, and sometimes is the way in which we view sacrifice. Unfortunately, all too often the way in which we view sacrifice. So you sacrifice your children not because it's a joyous offering to God, but because you're doing it under dire circumstances. And so, better one child than all of them and yourself besides, right? So in a period of drought, say, when there appears to be no hope, you want to do something to move the hand of God to bring blessing, or else everyone's going to die. So something has to be grudgingly sacrificed in the hope that God will be moved and will bless you. So
That was the old thinking,
yeah, but
rather
it's
than
also
transforming
it's
us.
also present in our own thinking, unfortunately. So it's important to really take a careful look at that, because sacrifice should perfect the conscience of the worshiper, and he's not really going to explain how it does that, but we should have a good handle on how that happens through the Eucharist, which is an act of self-sacrifice by ourselves. We or we should be joining our sacrifice with that of Christ. So we'll continue and probably finish this section next week.